Donald Trump, you ain't nothing but a damn hypocrite. He said that the immigrants are taking black jobs. What in the hell do you think he was talking about? Immigrants ain't taking shit. You taking them, Mr. Trump.
By addressing the elephant in the room, sir. A lot of people did not think it was appropriate for you to be here today. You have pushed false claims about some of your rivals, from Nikki Haley to former President Barack Obama, saying that they were not born in the United States, which is not true. You have told 4 congresswomen of color who were American citizens to go back to where they came from. You have used words like animal and rabid to describe black district attorneys. You've attacked black journalists, calling them a loser, saying the questions that they ask are, quote, stupid and racist. You've had dinner with a white supremacist at your Mar-a-Lago resort. So my question, sir, now that you are asking black supporters to vote for you, why should black voters trust you after you have used language like that?
Well, first of all, I don't think I've ever been asked a question in such a horrible manner. First question. You don't even say, hello, how are you? Are you with ABC? Because I think they're a fake news network, a terrible network. And I think it's disgraceful that I came here in good spirit. I love the black population of this country. I've done so much for the black population of this country, including employment, including opportunity zones with Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, which is one of the greatest programs ever for black workers and black entrepreneurs. I've done so much, and and I say this, historically black colleges and universities were out of money. They were stone cold broke, and I saved them, and I gave them long-term financing, and nobody else was doing it. I think it's a very rude introduction. I don't know exactly why you would do something like that. And let me go a step further.
We're joined now by DEI labor attorney Jason Schwartz. Mr. Schwartz, thanks so much for joining us. First, just want to ask your initial reaction to the scope of the executive order and the employees placed on leave.
Sure. So nice to be with you. The scope of this order is huge. Really dramatic change, not only for government contractors, but for all private sector corporations.
And Trump notably revoked the executive order signed by LBJ back in 1965, which prohibited discriminatory practices in employment decisions for federal contractors. What sort of immediate impact could we start to see?
So the president, as you said, revoked the 1965 executive order from President Johnson and has flipped the requirements so that government contractors now have to agree not to engage in any sort of DEI program that has a preference based on race or gender. So not only do they get rid of their affirmative action programs, but they have to agree not to engage in certain DEI practices. That's a complete reversal. The OFCCP is now ordered to immediately cease its enforcement efforts under the 1965 Civil Rights Program. And instead, contractors agree, again, that they cannot engage in any kind of preferential DEI programs. And the order suggests that that will be enforced not just by the federal government, but that private citizens are going to be deputized to bring what are called false claims actions in order to enforce that government contractor requirement.
Now, the White House said that the executive order demands departments and agencies take strong action to end DEI policies in the private sector as well, and that the Attorney General should also encourage the end of DEI in the private sector. What could those actions look like?
So, Lindsay, the most dramatic thing about that is the president literally asked the heads of every federal agency to provide a list of 9 targets against whom they will initiate investigations and potential litigation to challenge private sector diversity programs that they believe are unlawful. So each agency is going to be on the hunt for, and it's the mission is find the biggest whales you can.
Out! Immigrants ain't taking shit. You taking them, Mr. Trump. I ain't afraid of you.
Executive order says look for large publicly traded corporations, large employers, large foundations, and send these lists to the White House so that the agencies can initiate investigations and litigation. I think that's going to be a substantial enforcement effort in the private sector, challenging lots of DEI programs at many, many companies.
Leading up to Trump's second term, we saw a number of large corporations begin to roll back their DEI policies. Do you think that more companies will continue to follow suit?
Very much so. No one wants to be on this list of 9 companies. So I think part of the intended effect of this order is not only to find big companies to make an example of, but to scare everybody else into rolling back their programs.
Okay.
DEI is not a scapegoat for everything. He showed up with one message. It's DEI's fault. Then Hegseth says DEI. Then Duffy says DEI. And then J.D. Vance, maybe playing a little bit of cleanup, says, well, if it wasn't DEI in terms of the pilots it's very stressful to work with people when we have these kinds of DEI policies. DEI is not a scapegoat for everything.
In the hell do you think he was talking about? Immigrants ain't taking shit. You taking them.
To escape Jim Crow laws and to find greater economic opportunity and stability. Federal jobs were accessible through merit-based civil service exams and somewhat shielded black workers from rampant discrimination. Certainly not entirely, but it was better than the alternative in many cases. Jobs within the federal government have throughout history and today offered relatively good pay, health care, retirement security, job security, and stronger workplace protections compared to the private sector. And all of these factors made the civil service a crucial part of creating and sustaining America's black middle class. Joining me with more on this is Aaron Haynes, editor-at-large at the 19th and host of The Amendment podcast, and Professor Imani Perry, professor of African-American Studies at Harvard University, author of many important books, including her latest, Black in Blues, How a Color Tells the Story of My People. Good morning to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Professor Perry, between 1915 and 1970, about 6 million black people moved out of the rural South to the more urban North, where there was a promise of greater opportunity in both the private and the public sectors. But part of this was an expansion of employment for black people in the public sector.
Sure. I mean, employment opportunities were largely the greatest motivator of the Great Migration, with 6 million people moving. And given that there was continued discrimination even in urban centers, the relatively accessible possibilities that were secured in federal and civil service were extraordinary. And that existed even after Woodrow Wilson discriminated. You know, he created a racial discrimination within the federal government when he entered office. So if we think about that trajectory, one of the things that is essential is to understand not only did it provide greater economic security and possibility, but also that these forms of work are a kind of service to the nation. Right? We don't want to forget that operating in federal civil service means that you are supporting the functioning of the country. And so given this long trajectory of ongoing discrimination, that these forms of employment in service to the nation were actually one of the few areas that black people could rely upon to enter the middle class, it's potentially devastating that the loss of that sector.
And it'll affect black people disproportionately. Aaron, Imani was just talking about Woodrow Wilson. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson became the first Southerner to win the presidency since before the Civil War. And almost immediately after his election, he began a policy of segregation within the federal workforce. We saw back then the impact it had on black American workers and their prosperity. So we've got historical context for what we may see coming.
Absolutely. This is why it is so important to know history, Allie. I mean, I know Imani also knows this history well. This is not the first time a president has used racist policies to slash black workers from the federal government. I mean, President Trump is literally taking a page from Woodrow Wilson's playbook. And this was a surprise resegregation order, of the federal workforce. After he was elected in 1912, black people voted for Woodrow Wilson. You mentioned the post office. I mean, before this resegregation order, over 60% of the federal jobs at the time were at the post office, and black people had a lot of those jobs. The Treasury was the second largest employer of black workers, in the federal workforce. And so these jobs, as Imani mentioned, represented opportunity for so many black Americans, many of whom were working previously in service jobs that paid less money And, you know, this segregation order changed all of this dramatically. It increased the wage gap. It increased racial inequality. And so, you know, we talk about Black workers, you know, being qualified in this current day context, right? Like this so-called conversation around the need to address, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. But this literally was a colorblind process. As you point out, Allie, you pass the test, you're qualified, right, no matter who you are. So this helped to really address so much of the systemic inequality in the labor market. And there was, you know, President Woodrow Wilson took direct aim at that then. And certainly that's kind of what we're seeing in this current moment.
Imani, Black federal workers have been, and civil servants in generally, have been on the forefront of the fight for civil rights and labor protections.
But you said George Floyd's death was a terrible thing.
Terrible.
Why are African Americans still dying at the hands of law enforcement in this country?
And so are white people. So are white people. What a terrible question to ask. So are white people. More white people, by the way. More white people.
CBS News looked into the president's claim, and studies show African Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police. But because whites make up a larger share of the population, the overall number of whites killed is higher. Also at the White House today, President Trump signed an executive order to hold China accountable for its oppressive actions against the people of Hong Kong.